Good evening. Good evening. I'm John Pergola, Executive Director of Trinity Academy in Portland. On behalf of Trinity Academy, the University of Portland, and George Fox University, I would like to welcome you to the Buckley Center Auditorium for tonight's lecture, Civility, Civics, and the Fate of the City of Man, by Patrick Deneen. I also welcome all those who were unable to come in person, but who are joining us via live stream on Trinity's YouTube channel. As we begin, we would like to ask Rick Gans, founder and director of the Faber Institute, to come forward to ask a blessing on our evening.
You should pray as you wish. But perhaps I could offer 3 different ways you might consider praying. And you could pick one. The first thing is I believe that war in the world would not be possible if people regularly got together and reached past the knowledge they have toward things they don't know yet. Learn to love what they don't quite see yet. And so for us to gather like this and to stretch our minds and our hearts with an outstanding lecturer to pull us beyond what we know into what we don't yet know is a beautiful act of defiance in the face of a world vexed on too many fine days. Perhaps we could pray in that way. The second way is I couldn't help but be impressed as I was sitting quietly there and people were coming in, and I noticed on the screen all the screens, the different people who will speak, who've given their time to be here, and glittering accomplishments of each one. It's really hard to earn those credentials. But I kind of found myself flashing to each of us coming into heaven and seeing a PowerPoint on the screen saying what God sees when he looks at our life, what he would put up on a slide like that for each of us. And it caused me to think of all the hidden things that even these brilliant speakers have in their lives that we don't see. Suffering they've had, things they've really wrestled hard with, or things they still don't understand, even though they've been at it for so many years. So perhaps we could pray for each of them, both in what we see of them tonight, but also what we don't see, and how often what we don't see gives such credibility to what we can see. And the last thought, just a suggestion that you might choose to pray for, is for Trinity Academy. We know that people are looking for places to entrust their children to be taught well. But often we know that people want what they want, rather than trusting an institution that works in the deep and tested stuff of deep culture. We need such places like this, and it takes courage for them to fight for their existence. And so perhaps we could pray for prosperity of this work that is the Trinity Academy. And especially for all of you students, if you are students from that academy, that you feel blessed by being here among people so vastly older than you. We wish you much good. So here's just a simple prayer. Come, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Help us be only here, only now. We know that real presence can be hard to achieve when there's so much pulling on our attention each day. Help us into real presence through the sending of the Holy Spirit. Bless this night, make it more than we imagined, and allow us to walk from this space more
So Trinity Academy is a school right here in North Portland, serving students in grades 6 through 12. We opened in 2011 with 5 students under the leadership of our head of school, Dr. Joanna Clark. Where is Dr. Clark? Oh, right there. Our current enrollment is just over 100 students, and we recently launched a building campaign that will enable us to grow and serve about 250 students in the coming years. Trinity Academy is part of a national network of schools using the Trinity Schools curriculum. We combine a classical seminar-based humanities and religion program with an ambitious science and math program that includes computer programming in the upper grades. And then participation in the fine arts, including strings, vocal music, music composition, studio art, art history, and drama, for all students over the course of their Trinity education. You can find information on the back table, or I encourage you to learn more about us at pdxtrinity.org. I also want to briefly mention that we're thankful for a $100,000 matching gift challenge put up by 2 generous donors this spring to help us with our annual fund, primarily providing need-based scholarships for 60% of our students, and also helping to support our amazing Trinity faculty. The first $100,000 given by June 15th will be matched to our annual fund or our building fund. If you're interested in the matching challenge, you'll find spring appeal brochures on the back table just outside the door, or you can find information on our website. Any support is greatly appreciated. Trinity Academy is a community of learners who are serious about the life of the mind and also intentional about our Christian culture as a context for deep learning. At our core, we are an ecumenical Christian school, bringing together Catholics, evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Orthodox Christians, non-denominational Christians, and others into our community of learners. We believe that the way we bring Christians together is part of our vocation as a school and is much needed in the Portland metro region and beyond. In the recent past, we've hosted public lectures by current University of Dallas President Jonathan Sanford and Calvin University Professor James K.A. Smith. We found these lectures to promote healthy discussion on important topics among the wider Christian community. In 2020, we received a very generous gift that included funds to support an ongoing Freedom Lecture Series, which would be, to quote, offered to the school community and the broader Portland community, encouraging Christian concepts of freedom and the ascendancy of the Spirit in mankind. The Freedom Lecture Series gives us an opportunity to offer a clear and compelling voice in our broader culture aimed at winning hearts and minds of the young in particular for Christ and supporting Trinity Academy's vision of human flourishing. Inspired by 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, and Paul's use of his freedom in Christ to win others to Christ. And as Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 3:17, we know that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Though the benefactors who have provided this ongoing support for the lecture series wish to remain anonymous, we still would like to take a moment to thank them for their generosity. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. I would also like to thank tonight's co-sponsors. We are delighted that the University of Portland and George Fox University both stepped forward with generous sponsorships for tonight's event, and that we have accomplished scholars from both of their political science departments here to join the discussion. I would like to thank personally from the University of Portland our panelists, Dr. Bill Curtis, Professor of Political Science, Dr. Dan McGinty, Director of the Dundon Merkle Center, and Joe Khalil, the Director of Events. And from George Fox University, I would specifically like to thank our panelists, Dr. Mark Hall from the Department of Political Science, Chief Strategy Officer Sean Daly, and Dr. Joseph Clare, Executive Dean of Cultural Enterprise and Professor of Theology and Culture. And I would also like to thank our third panelist, my good friend, the Colonel Reverend Dr. Sean Nayland from Highland Christian Center for agreeing to participate tonight. We will introduce our panelists more fully a bit later in the program. So it is a special pleasure for me to introduce our main speaker, Professor Patrick Deneen. Patrick has become well known as a during his years teaching and writing at Princeton University, Georgetown University, and now the University of Notre Dame. Patrick Deneen is professor of political science and holds the David A. Potenziani Memorial Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He has written 4 books and edited 3 others. Most recently is his 2018 title, Why Liberalism Failed, a thought-provoking work that drew positive responses from a range of thinkers and public figures, including David Brooks, Cornel West, Rod Dreher, Archbishop Charles Chaput, and President Barack Obama. Patrick is a former Trinity parent, having sent 2 of his sons to Trinity School at Meadowview in Falls Church, Virginia, during his time at Georgetown. I also believe he taught our own Trinity Academy faculty member, Mr. Ben Mislevich, at Notre Dame. So, and I don't know if Patrick will remember this story, but the first time we met was when he visited my former school, Trinity School at Greenlawn in South Bend, Indiana, around the time he came to teach at Notre Dame. What impressed me in our conversation was a discussion we had about one of my former professors, and this actually came up again today in our conversation. And Patrick had said something along the lines of, I heard him speak recently, and it really challenged me to rethink a number of my assumptions about Christianity and political life. So for someone who was already such an accomplished scholar, to let new ideas challenge him on that level was commendable. And I think he has much to offer us at a time when our society has become so divided that we often find it difficult to talk to each other, let alone learn from each other. It was a pleasure to have numerous other conversations with Patrick over the next several years at football tailgaters, carol sings, Notre Dame events, and gatherings of the Dudes, a group of Catholic men who met irregularly in South Bend for drinks and conversation. It has certainly been wonderful to reconnect with Patrick for this event, and I am delighted he's here. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen.
So much, John. My deep thanks to my friend and former neighbor, John Kerdelak, for that introduction and for inviting me here tonight. Notre Dame and South Bend's loss is definitely Portland's gain, so congratulations to all of you. And thanks as well to the Trinity Academy, as was mentioned. I don't think you're ever really a former Trinity parent. That's not a lifetime Trinity parent. Really just a school whose mission and whose curriculum and commitment I really believe in, and I'm really delighted to be here under that auspice. And to reconnect with some old friends in political science departments out here at George Fox University and here at the University of Portland, a school founded by the order that also founded the University of Notre Dame. It was particularly like my first time to be here at the University of Portland to see the school that I often hear mentioned as one of our schools. So I was discussing with Mr. Kerdelak and a few others what I want to talk about here tonight, and it seems that since I'm a professor of political science and we live in a time where it's difficult not to talk about politics, at the same time difficult to talk well about politics, that I might try to talk about politics in a way that allows us to see a little bit of what might be going on, some of the reasons, the deeper reasons for why it's so difficult for us to not only to agree about politics, which is always difficult, but even to talk civilly about politics. If we agree about anything when it comes to politics today, and we don't agree about much, it seems that we agree that we are living through some very difficult times of intense political disagreement. And I just want to, I mentioned this at dinner to someone tonight. There's never been a time in human history where human beings have simply gotten along and agreed on anything. That's a false nostalgic memory that might rattle around in someone's mind. Our politics and our societies are always riven by disagreement. But our time seems to be not only one of intense disagreement, but one of extreme incivility. It's difficult, extremely difficult to discuss our differences with at least a modicum of mutual respect and goodwill that it seems should be the hallmark of good citizenship. Much of our politics today is less or consists very little of reasonable exchange of ideas between people, again, of good faith and goodwill, and rather much more of shouting and chanting and denunciation, and outrage and invective, and even outright hatred and anger. Social media certainly hasn't helped this condition. One can often engage in these kinds of behaviors from the protection of anonymity or these distance, but I don't think it's the sole reason. Indeed, I don't think it's maybe the main reason. There's always been disagreement, but it is a particular form today that social media contributes to. But it doesn't seem to me that it is at its core, its basis. We do seem to agree that our nation is in the midst of some kind of a civil war, often called a cold civil war. But there's increasing discussion of whether a hot civil war might be on the horizon, and even some who entertain the possibility that this might be a good thing, that a hot civil war that might result in separation is what might be the best solution for politics. Now, we should never whitewash the past or engage, as I suggested, in a kind of misty nostalgia. Still, many of us can remember a time when politics seemed at least a little bit less uncivil. It was once the case that senators were renowned for having fierce debates on the floor of the Senate, and then retreat for a friendly drink at the Monocle, those of you know D.C., a bar close to the Capitol, where they would, in a sense, make up and have a sort of friendly meal or a drink, typically a drink, after the debate. People in an earlier time knew relatively little about their neighbors' political views. Maybe a yard sign might indicate something, but it wasn't a topic that one knew a lot about. Rather, one engaged in what was sometimes, sort of nasty neighborhood gossip, but more often than not, stories about one's children and discussions of vacation plans. The holiday season was typically not preceded by countless articles on how to discuss or how not to discuss politics around the Thanksgiving table. Rather, lots of articles about how to cook the turkey and whether the pilgrims eat green bean casserole or not. Today, we have children blocking parents or no longer speaking to siblings on the basis of political views that were not necessarily always in the forefront of our discussions in our families or over the dinner table. Again, technology has something to do with the bitterness, but we exaggerate its influence, I think, if we think it can explain everything about our contemporary incivility. Now, what I'm not here tonight to do is to suggest that we all should just get along. I'm a student of politics and the history of politics, and I recognize that politics is always inevitably the realm of contestation, and sometimes pretty fierce contestation. But what I do want to explore tonight is what I find to be really interesting, and I think often overlooked, connection. A connection that's more than just etymological between the words, such words as politics and politeness, and of civics and civility. These two words derive from the most ancient languages of the West, from Greek and Latin, polis and cives, both words that mean city or the political unit. Both of them speak to a dimension of what is shared or what is common, how it is we are to interact as human beings, whether it's politics and its related words, policy, or even police, and civics and its related words, citizen and civilization, and of course politeness and politesse. These words that we often regard as both public and also more private realms of intimate social interaction. Politeness, to be politique, to be polished is another word that derives from this root word of political. And it related to the Latin word cives, the word civility, and to be civil, and to be civilized. These words and these concepts are more than just coincidentally related. but rather point to the basic question of how it is we are to get along. In the classical political tradition, something that I know the Trinity students study with great seriousness, they spend an entire year reading the great text of antiquity. There was a deep continuity between these concepts, and again, one that's more than just etymological. For the Greeks, in particular, there was a way of thinking about politics in which it was understood that politics was the special sphere and domain of human beings. It was the place and space where human beings interacted. And indeed, it was the place and space, in a sense, where only human beings interacted because of the distinctiveness of human beings. As Aristotle famously stated, that creature that is no part of the city, that does not need to be in a city, is either a beast or a god. Is either a beast or a god. It has no need of being in the city. One sees this demonstrated, and it's an observation that Aristotle quotes at this point when he makes this claim. One sees this demonstrated in one of the most certainly memorable passages of Homer's Odyssey, one of my favorite books. I wrote my dissertation on the Odyssey. You could be a political scientist and write great works of literature, as we might have some hope for the future of the academy. There's a great discussion, it seems to me, an observation about the connection of politics and politeness and manners. That's at the heart of one of the most famous episodes of the Homeric corpus, which has to do with what happens when a stranger arrives someplace new. If one is a stranger arriving someplace new in a civilized place, in a polis, in a kiwis, in a place that is civilized, one expects and indeed hopes to be received with a formal greeting and almost immediately with an invitation to come to dinner. Let us eat together. Let us break bread together. First, we eat and then we talk. This is almost every scene in the Odyssey. First we eat and then we talk. First we engage in that elemental activity that keeps us alive, and then afterwards we ask the visitor to repay this welcome with a story. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about where you came from, who your people are, what your land is like, and how you got here. This is much of what happens, at least in the initial interactions between Odysseus on his journey home, and all of the various places and the creatures and the people and the non-people that he meets. To be a human is to rely upon the formalities and those manners in order for us to know the kind of person that we're dealing with. If we're greeted with by someone politely, even a stranger, someone we haven't met before, they tell us something about themselves. In a sense, we know these are people we can engage with. And this is not just true of strangers, but of acquaintances, and even of friends. And of course, within a family, we don't abandon, hopefully, manners and politeness. It is how we interact and keep our interactions at the level of a kind of cordiality, even when there's disagreement. But of course, how one is greeted by a stranger is especially important, because we don't know what we're getting ourselves into. Much of the Odyssey, in fact, is related firsthand by Odysseus. As he arrives at one particular island, the island of the Phaeacians. And much of what many of us know of the Odyssey is a story that's told by Odysseus that takes place after that dinner. They invite him, they say, welcome, come to our table, and after we finish eating, tell us about yourself. And about 6 or 8 books of the Odyssey is just Odysseus telling us about his journey, how he got there. Imagine, here he is, having been fed, having been buffeted by the sea, subject to the revenge and the ill will of the gods, and finally knows he's arrived at a polis, a well-governed political order that demonstrates a highly civilized form of life through its politeness, through its civility, the relief he must have felt to be on the island of the Phaeacians. And this is how he repays his guests. Among the first stories that he tells to these gracious hosts is about a very different reception that he received from Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops, the son of Poseidon, and thus a creature that is both a god and a beast. The Cyclops is without a doubt one of the most memorable, the most beastly, the most vicious and horrible creatures ever portrayed in world literature. Imagine the scene. Here's Odysseus, recumbent, perhaps on a pillow. Everyone's digesting what was a fabulous meal with delicious wine. A little bit like we're feeling tonight, those of us who went out to dinner just before now. Enjoying a conversation with someone who's interesting, seems to have traveled, has stories to tell. And he tells about how he arrived at an island, not unlike the one he's on right now, and encountered a creature with one eye, who upon encountering these strangers, grabs two of their number, smashes their heads against the cave wall, and devours them in front of everyone raw. And then lovingly, in the midst of this, describes to his host how their blood and the gristle dripped from his lips and onto his chin, and their bone and their skins was caught between his teeth. Imagine how your stomach must feel. And then over the course of days, he proceeds to devour dwindling pairs of Odysseus' men for his next number of meals, regarding them not as honored guests, but as raw meat. The poet tells us something about the Cyclops. The Cyclopes in the plural. They are creatures not only who lack politeness, but they are without politics. This is what he says, Odysseus in Book 9. We sailed further along and reached the country of the lawless, outrageous Cyclopes, who, putting all of their trust in the immortal gods, neither plow with their hands nor plant anything, but all grows for them without seed planting, without cultivation. These people have no institutions, no meetings for councils. Rather, they make their habitations in caverns out among the peaks of the high mountains, and each one is a law for his own wives and children, and cares nothing about the others. They are radically separate and self-absorbed creatures. They only have one eye. They can't see very well. And of course, this feature of the Cyclopes is demonstrated not only in Polyphemus' barbaric and cannibalistic treatment of Odysseus' men, but I think as well by the treatment of the Cyclopes for each other. Remember, part of this famous story is that Cyclops has his eye put out by Odysseus and the remaining men when they're finally able to get back at him. And in the bellows of pain, right, this absolute glaring, deep, profound pain, he runs out of the cave, bellowing and hollering, asking his compatriots for help. And they ask, "What's the matter, Polyphemus?" And he says, "No man has put out my eye." The name that Odysseus has told him is his name. And they all say, "Okay," and they go back to bed. Now, one would think if you heard someone bellowing in pain and saying something really weird, like "no man has put out my eye," your first impulse might not be to go back to bed. But this is the Cyclops. They care not for each other. Thus, we see a continuity between politics and politeness and its lack, its absence. And this is what Aristotle is remarking upon. Not only does he use the example of the Cyclops to demonstrate his observation that politics is necessary and unique as a domain for human beings, where we come together and come to know each other, and the way that we come to know each other. But that the creation of the polis, of the first polis, is intimately tied and necessarily tied to the development of what we think of today as manners. That polis is intimately tied and related to the idea of politeness or civility. Just after these passages I've been referring to, where he says that a creature that lives outside of the city is either a beast or a god, this is what Aristotle says at the conclusion of the first chapter of Politics, a book called Politics. He makes this intriguing claim. I'm going to read this paragraph by him. He says the following: "The impulse to form a political partnership is present in all men by nature. But the man who first united people in such a partnership was the greatest of all benefactors. For just as man is the best of all animals when perfected, so he is the worst of all when separated from law and justice. For unrighteousness is most pernicious when possessed of tools. The unrighteous are most pernicious when they have tools. And man is born possessing tools for the use of wisdom and virtue, which it is possible to employ entirely for opposite ends. Hence, when devoid of virtue, man is the most unholy and savage of animals, especially in regards to sex and food. Now, there's a lot there, so let me restate this in our language. Humans are endowed as tool-making creatures. We're technological animals. And that allows us either to act in ways that are even worse than the beasts, because those tools can be put in the service of very savage and barbaric ends. As we know, we can do things savagely and barbarically with far more efficiency and brutality than the animals can, often two animals. But these tools can also be used in the service of making us refined, elevated creatures, of perfecting us. Unlike the beasts or even cyclopes, humans can do and they can take what they want using all kinds of technology, allowing us with great facility and efficiency to kill, to steal, to devour, to decimate, to humiliate. Think of any vice possible, and you can think of tools that we have created to pursue those vices. And we can do so in ways far worse and far more effective than any creature that just has teeth or claws to affect those ends. We do things that make the Cyclops look civilized. Alternatively, our same tool-making ability can make us into something quite opposite, into civilized creatures, or those creatures, humans, that we are, in a sense, designed to become. This is what Aristotle said. He uses the word perfected. You students out there, that word is tele, to achieve our telos, to achieve our end, to make us into the thing we have the potential of becoming, to be perfected. And to bring this point home, Aristotle points to two areas of life in which these two possibilities of both depravity and virtue are most vividly and immediately on display: food and sex. These, of course, are the most instinctive, the most animalistic of our desires, of our nature. We don't have to be taught to want either. And babies know immediately that they're hungry. And teenagers know immediately. You get the idea. Both of these activities, of course, can and sadly are often pursued in the most beastly manner, as Cyclops demonstrates. Or in another context of Greek mythology, satyrs, that half beast, half man, those goat men, right, who are almost always portrayed as running after the beautiful nymphs with their goat feet in order to ravish them. If our nature is untutored, we're not just beastly, we're worse than beasts, because we can pursue these desires, sex and food, among other things, with the kinds of tools that Aristotle suggests make us particularly potentially vicious. But note what Aristotle says. We are endowed by nature to use tools for the purpose of achieving wisdom and virtue. It is not only essential to our nature to be technological animals, but to use that technology for our perfection. Both politeness and politics are tools. These are two tools that humans have developed that are, in their best sense, used to elevate our appetites, our desires, to make us fully or perfect us as human beings. And we can start and begin to see this, especially in those two appetites mentioned by Aristotle, sex and food. Now, since there are young people here, let me avoid too much controversy, and maybe I'll be invited back someday, and I'll speak about this in relationship to food tonight. But if I'm invited back, I'm willing to talk about the other one. And let me talk about one form of politeness that I think exhibits this fact. It reflects Aristotle's understanding of how we can be tutored to take what is a basic appetite and through the use of tools to perfect our nature. And I want to talk just about something very simple, which is table manners. Of course, eating is a profoundly natural human act. But if one begins to think about it, this natural act is something that every human civilization has developed profound and extensive customs that relate to, govern, shape, and are intended in some ways to combine with this natural function. Now, this is not to say that it's all the same. And one of the more fascinating things about comparative cultural studies is to note how many different ways human beings have developed these various manners and approaches to eating. Whether it's chopsticks, whether it's even eating with the hand. But that there is no civilization that is known to humankind that has not developed extensive customs and manners that relate to food. And this is in significant part because precisely where I began. That in a sense, eating reflects something very dangerous and potentially horrific about human beings. It's something that is elemental. The cyclops is something that haunts us because we are cyclops potentially. He's a beast or a god, but he's also in some ways recognizably human. We are capable not only, of course, of eating to excess, of eating unhealthy, of overeating, of eating too much weight, of eating in ways that are not good for us. But of course, it's also potentially an activity that involves savagery. Human beings are omnivores. Nearly anything that's biological is food. We are not only omnivores, we are the greatest predator our world has ever known. We are thus capable of great savagery, and in our treatment of the natural world, I think we see a lot of evidence of that. We arguably have cyclopean qualities. Human beings have, indeed, in our history, demonstrated that we are more than willing to be cannibals. And not just when we land, our plane crashes and we have no choice. There have been civilizations that have been developed customs of cannibalism, in which other human beings are potentially meat. W.H. Auden, the poet, recognized this fact. In his commonplace book, he wrote the following line. The slogan of hell is, eat or be eaten. That's what hell would be like, in which we regard everyone else as food. Thus, in a sense, to shroud this aspect, and indeed to tutor this aspect of our nature, we develop manners. Manners that emphasize the distinctiveness of our humanness, our capacity to be civilized. Manners are at once table manners, are at once an acknowledgement of our nature. It's not a denial of the fact that we need to eat, we have to eat to survive. But in some ways, it shrouds, it minimizes, and in certain senses elevates this very elemental act of our nature, and habituates us into a kind of second nature. Elevates a very elemental activity and makes it refined. And we just came from a dinner, and I don't think anyone at that dinner for a moment thought, we are now engaged in savagery. It was quite fine. It was very civilized. Very fine restaurant. The meals came out. They were brought by people on nice plates. It looked lovely. So this very elemental activity was refined and lovely. A moment of civilization. The philosopher Erwin Strauss wrote the following. Considering our bodily and intellectual nature, we do well to envisage the possibility that it is not society that first brought man into conflict with nature, but it is man's natural opposition to nature which enables him to produce society, history, and conventions. That it is natural for us to produce society, history, and conventions. This is part of what makes us, in a sense, human. And I want to demonstrate this by resort to a piece of technology, a tool in exactly the way that Aristotle suggests. This is a really hot piece of high technology. Hold on a second. I put my phone down. This is the technology. This is called a fork. I asked John Perlap to bring this fork tonight to demonstrate exactly the kind of technology and tool that Aristotle was speaking about. And I didn't even have to tell him what the fork should look like. He knew exactly what it should look like. He said what kind? And you could have asked him, what kind of fork? What should the fork? He knew exactly a 4-tined fork. This is sort of the Platonic version of the fork. How many of you have ever really thought about, why does it have 4 tines? What is it? How did it get to be this way? Well, I have done extensive fork studies. This is part of my training as Ph.D. in political philosophy. And my analysis of the fork that dates many years has revealed the following. The fork dates back to the Middle Ages, around the 11th century, the first time that we identified the fork. It was the beginning of courtly life, the beginnings of an aristocracy. It was also a time when meat was being served regularly, cooked meat being served regularly in meals. And at that time, there began to be the desire to develop the kinds of activities, the kinds of table manners that we begin to recognize today. And since it was necessary to cut the meat, they were pretty tough cuts certainly back then, what was typically done was to take 2 knives, 2 very sharp knives, and to cut the meat. And then once you wanted to cut a piece of meat, you take the knife, stick it in a piece of meat, and stick it in your mouth. Now one could see potential disadvantages to this. Many injuries would occur in the course of eating, but the real problem was that if you ever try to cut a piece of meat using one knife to hold it and another knife to cut it, you'll quickly develop a kind of wheel around the axle situation. The meat will start turning, and you'll quickly realize, I gotta get something that can really hold this meat down. So somebody had the idea, why don't we create basically 2 knife points that will hold the meat and then I can cut it. First fork. And we still have this version of the fork. I think that cutlery set. We only use 1 time per year. It sits in the back of the drawer, lonely and bereft, until Thanksgiving. And then it's pulled out, so Dad or whoever might be in your house would please cut the meat. And now you get to use that 2-tine fork. So the 2-tine fork, is the original fork, was just really used to hold the meat, so it could be cut, and then you use the knife and stick it into your mouth again. It took a while to learn that this might not be the best way to approach how one would eat. And so eventually people began to think, not only can I use this 2-time thing potentially to put the food in my mouth, I can pick up other items with it. Pick up peas. I can pick up more than 1 pea. Pick up several peas. Pick up a number of different items. And so my study of forks, ranging back many years, in the long study of forks, what I discovered is that human beings did what human beings always do, which is more, adding more and more times. First there were 2 times. Then there were 3 times, which we have retained in the form of the salad fork. And then there were 4 times, and 5 times, and 6 times. There are 8-time forks. You can go to museums and see 10-time forks. But you can see what happens. It's a little bit like the Gillette razor. And if you get a little redundant, how many blades do I really need to shave? Isn't 8 enough? Why did we get to 4? 4 times. It's a really interesting question. Why not 8? Why not 7? Why not 6? 4 times seem in some ways to comport both with the convention of eating with a fork, but also with something interestingly natural. Much wider than 4, you begin to get something too wide for the human mouth. 5 would be possible, but 5 starts to look like the hand. And we're, in a sense, replacing the hand. So 4 became the number that was still conventional, artifice, right? Still revealed the mannerisms of this activity. And avoided both exceeding the width of our mouth, but also not merely mimicking the hand. The 4-time fork became the natural way for us to think about how it is that we use these implements, these tools. But the real reason for the fork eventually became not just that we could pick our food up and bring it to our face, but in many ways because it makes it more difficult to eat. Those of you who are parents here, your children don't remember this. You young people, I should say, don't remember this, but parents will know this, which is that teaching your children to eat with utensils is among the worst years of parents. It is an absolutely astonishingly terrible time in terms of kind of constant conflict and argument at the dinner. Use your fork. Use your knife. Don't use your hands. What do children want to do? They just want to fill themselves as quickly as possible. And the way you fill yourself as quickly as possible is to move your head into your bowl or take your fist and raise the food into your face. My son Francis, who Mr. Slevich knows, he had a particular way of eating rice, which was to place his mouth at the table edge and use the fork as always. Move the rice into his mouth. Francis, if you're watching this, I'm sorry to reveal your secret. Learning how to eat with a fork is not natural to us. It's artificial. We raise the food to our faces. We eat in smaller bites than we might otherwise wish. It slows us down. There are much faster ways to eat. My dog does this. Maybe you have a dog now. A dog does not eat slowly. A dog consumes and devours very quickly. It makes us, in a sense, more human, because as human beings, we don't have the snout that extends past our nose. And we are upright creatures. Eating with a fork and raising the food to our mouth allows us to sit upright. And over dinner, to have something called conversation, which means a turning to. To engage in companionship, which means to break bread together. Bread, companion. To engage, in other words, those human activities that we associate with a very fine meal. Not just consuming, but being with friends, with colleagues, with family. And the food is an occasion for storytelling and conviviality, for being human. We not only, of course, develop table manners, but we develop complex table manners. Now, my wife is German, and when she eats, she has a knife and a fork, and she uses her strong hand, her right hand, to cut, and her left hand to raise the food to her mouth, which for Americans is very weird, because why would you use your left hand to raise your food to your face? Right? We Americans, of course, we switch hands, if you learn this as an American. We cut our meat, and then we switch the fork and the knife, and then we use the fork. Which, if you're in Europe, they look at you as if you landed from Mars. Why are you possibly doing that? But you should feel happy and be quite self-satisfied about this. Because in a lecture delivered at Harvard University, Miss Manners herself, made the following observation. Quote, American table manners, if anything, are more advanced form and civilized behavior than European, because they are more complicated and thus further removed from the practical result of eating, which is always a sign of refinement. So we are more refined than the Europeans. Go figure. Further, through our table manners, we seek to diminish the signs of our savagery. I asked Mr. Kerbalak to bring me a knife, and quite happily he said, a butter knife or a steak knife. I said, well, let's start with the butter knife. So this is what he brought me, a butter knife, which was at our table tonight as we ate dinner. Now notice that the knife that is on the table is incapable of cutting anything except butter. I can sit here and slice all day long. I was going to bring one with me on the plane. I only had carry-on luggage, and I knew they would confiscate it. Why? Oh my God. Confiscate this thing. We of course, place such knives on the table in order to diminish the fact that we are engaging in what is or could be seen as an act of savagery or barbarian. And notice that when you go to a fine restaurant, and this happened tonight, and you may notice of this, a few of you were sitting next to me, only at the moment that they bring the meat do they bring out the actual shark. Only at that moment, because they don't want to leave it on the table, just in case any of us are psychopaths. And notice as soon as we finish the meat, they take this knife away. This knife. Well, this knife is going away. You never know when a knife fight might break out. Never tempt our bestial side. Now, we tend to make fun of table manners as affectation, of kind of holdover of old aristocracy. Those of you who are of a certain age will remember one of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld, when Mr. Pitt, the British aristocrat, eats a Snickers bar with a fork and knife. And Elaine is looking at him with just absolute astonishment. Why would Mr. Pitt eat a Snickers bar with a fork and knife? And George says, well, these society types, they eat everything with a fork and knife. And by the end of the episode, everyone is sort of caught on to this, and everyone is eating cookies, and desserts with forks and knives. And Elaine just gets angry and gets shouting at him, "You've all gone mad." So we made fun of this, and a lot of movies are based on sort of making fun of table manners. Those of you who remember the movie Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts shows up at the restaurant. She's brought up on the wrong side of the tracks and doesn't know which fork and which knife to eat with. And they try to teach her, but she can't learn that in one day. But notice that far from being merely an aristocratic affectation, it is in fact the basis, some level, very similar, and reflects that civility also is kind of by extension of a lesson in a form of civics. It is that which is essential to civilization. This idea of a second nature that we develop from habits and habituation is not only reflected in such things as the knife and the fork as in table manners, but in other tools and technology. Among others, of course, the polis itself. While we are creatures that are naturally, Aristotle says, naturally inclined to form a polis, it's not automatic. It doesn't just sprout into being like a weed this time of year. And it's not merely about exercise of power and the pursuit of our desires, but like the fork, politics is, at its best, designed as an effort to restrain and to temper our political appetites, to force us in the political realm, as it were, to eat slowly. Think of something like Robert's Rules of Orders. If you've ever attended or participated in a meeting that uses Robert's Rules of Orders, you sort of think, what is this ridiculousness? Who's going to move the question, who will second the question? But notice all of these, like a fork, like table manners, are designed to slow us down, make us sure that as we proceed through this, we're proceeding through a kind of process that we can think and revise, and reflect, and slowly work our way to what could be savagery, simply getting my way. Politics is designed to slow us down, to make us civilized. T.S. Eliot understood as well as continuity of manners in food and in politics. He once wrote that the survival of the parliamentary system requires constant dining with your opponents. Echo our blessing tonight. So we witnessed a kind of breakdown in civility, certainly in our political spheres, and also arguably in our interpersonal sphere. And perhaps we should consider the ways in which these are not disconnected. Tocqueville observed that liberal democracies, we call them democrats, but we could say liberal democracies, would come to hate forms. This is what he writes in his book, Democracy in America. The egalitarians hate forms. Forms separate. They draw distinctions and boundaries. They define what is in and what is out. We don't like forms. And of course, forms are expressed, among other things, through formalities. We don't necessarily like to dress like this. We like to be informal. We now dress down Fridays, and dress down Thursdays, and dress down every day. You used to have to address someone by certain titles, Mr., Mrs., Professor, Doctor, and increasingly, or Father. Increasingly, those have dropped away, or they've kind of taken on a more informal affectation. Father O'Brien becomes Father Tim. Mr. and Mrs. Smith become Aunt Sue. Professor Deneen. I get emails that say, "Hey, Pat." Don't try that with me. In democracies, in modern societies, we prefer informality to directness, authenticity. We tend not to like formality. There's an entire genre of movies in which it's discovered that some American, it turns out, is an heir to the British or some other throne, and has to go over to that country and discovers these people are really uptight. They are seriously uptight with all their formalities, and they have to be taught by the down-home and down-to-earth American what it is to have fun. And so whether it's King Ralph or the Princess Diaries, we teach these people how to have fun, to relax, to loosen their lives, and just stop being so uptight. If we think about what is the American culinary contribution to the world, we can think of some things. I think we've done some good in the world in terms of what we've contributed. But to the world, what we have contributed mainly is taking all of their food types and turning them into something that can be eaten with our hands. Even pizza. If you ever go to Italy, one of the things you'll notice is, like Mr. Pitt, they eat their pizza with a fork and a knife. We tend not to do that. Not only do we make all food types into something edible with our hands, but preferably something that can be eaten with our hands while we are driving in a car. And thus, both the vehicle and the driver are fundamentally concerned with fuel pursuits. We could say that what we have in our society today increasingly reflects what I would describe as a kind of liberal, modern understanding of culture, to separate culture from our nature, to see our nature as in some ways needing to be revealed by releasing us from all of those conventions, those formalities that obscure our genuine use. We embrace the language of authenticity and see the conventional as mere artifice, as a kind of imposition on our natural freedom. Convention is regarded as an obstacle to the emergence of our authentic selves. And liberal, modern democratic societies come to embrace the ideal of the liberation of the self from the merely conventional. All you have to do is watch television for just a few minutes and listen to the slogans. Start listening to the slogans in light of this. Just do it. Think different. Be yourself. You only live once. Live your best life. Have it your way at Burger King. Notice how much of authenticity, as we hear it over and over again through advertising, promotes a culture of consumption. Being yourself means also liberating yourself from those constraints. Now, it's not that such worldviews and understandings were unknown in the classical tradition, but rather than praising them or seeing them as the desirable state of things, it regarded such a state of affairs as a diseased city, a diseased city. Plato describes such a city as a feverish city, a sick city. And the Bible certainly has its fair share of such cities. Sodom and Gomorrah, Nineveh, or Rome. Cities in which the definition of the city was, or the city was understood in which the interests of those in the city, the individual interests of those in the city, trumped concern for our common and shared life. Such cities were seen not as the normal form for cities, but as a deformation of the good city, of the ideal of the city, properly understood. Thus, when Augustine speaks of the city, he speaks of the city of God and contrasts it with the city of man. Civitate Dei, the city of God, the good city, is a city in which we attempt to attain true freedom, the freedom in Christ, or which would be, which of course itself is a kind of echo of what Matthew reports from Jesus, that we should be, or see ourselves as being a city on a hill. We should not hide our light. A phrase that would be taken up by John Winthrop as they traveled to what would become the United States, as they traveled to the new continent, in which he called for his Puritan confreres to be as a city on a hill. A city of individuals, in some ways, a city in which authenticity becomes the main aim, is in some ways an echo of the very first city mentioned in the Bible, the very first city mentioned by name, the city of Babel. The city of Babel, of course, was a city in which the denizens of that city desire and seek to create a great tower that might rise to heaven. But notice why they desire to do this. It's because they have already become so radically individual that nothing else will hold them together. This is what the Bible says in Genesis says. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Unless we build this tower to heaven, there is nothing that can hold us together. There is nothing that can bind us together. In other words, unless we have a project that is oriented in some ways challenging, arising, and making ourselves into the city of God, of doing the things out of a kind of hubris, we shall be scattered over the whole face of the earth. In a sense, God didn't need to give them different languages. They already had different languages. They were already radically individual themselves. In a polis, or in a city that is not properly formed and governed, the only thing that can hold us together is some kind of external activity, akin to Babel. Whether it's growth of economics or of empire, the glory of war, of dominion, and of mastery, the release of our appetites that becomes a kind of political project. So let me begin where I ended. Why is it that today we are in such internecine political disagreement and warfare? And it might be because of technology, it might be because of Donald Trump, it might be because of something in Washington, D.C. But I want to suggest that, like all projects like Babel, the effort to hold us together by a project based in hubris, based in an external project in which we are not, in a sense, understanding ourselves as having something in common, in which we attempt to cultivate those forms of politics and politeness by which we learn to self-govern our appetites. That we will reach a limit of those projects, as those in Babel. That project will reach its natural limit. And perhaps part of, or maybe quite a bit of what we are experiencing today, is what those people in Babel experienced. That project can never hold us together. And unless in some ways we revisit and revive anew that classical Aristotelian understanding that might involve in some ways understanding politics as a kind of fork, in which we learn and habituate ourselves to the tempering of our appetites, then perhaps what we have in store is to become ever more the city of Babel, which is not the city of man that I would prefer to live in.
Thank you very much. We have some excellent respondents here, and I'm just going, actually, if you could take the chairs up here, I'll go ahead and introduce you all, and then we'll give each of you a chance to respond and give Professor Deneen a chance to respond to what you have to say as well. So Professor Bill Curtis teaches courses on political theory and philosophy, the history of political thought, and constitutional law. He is also the University of Portland's pre-law advisor and faculty advisor to the mock trial team. Before coming to the University of Portland in 2007, he held visiting positions at the University of Vermont and the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He has an A.B. in government from Dartmouth College, a J.D. from the University of California, Hastings College of the Law, an M.A. in philosophy from Stanford University, and a Ph.D. in political science from Duke University. His research interests include theories of liberalism, classical liberalism and the free market, religion and politics, politics and literature, U.S. constitutional law, and American pragmatism. He has published articles in academic journals such as Political Theory, Contemporary Political Theory, and Contemporary Pragmatism. His book, Defending Rorty, Pragmatism and Liberal Virtue, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Mark David Hall is Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics and Faculty Fellow in the Honors Program at George Fox University. He is also associated faculty at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. In 2022-23, he will be a visiting fellow at Princeton University's James Madison program and a visiting scholar at the Mercatus Center. Mark earned a BA in Political Science from Wheaton College and a Ph.D. in Government from the University of Virginia. He has written, edited, or co-edited a dozen books, including Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, How Christianity is Advanced Liberty and Equality for All Americans. And the Colonel, Reverend Dr. Sean Nayland, is the senior pastor of Highland Christian Center in Portland, Oregon. Highland is a large, diverse, and growing church with over 1,200 members. Dr. Nayland is a senior executive leader who honed his skills in the military over a 35-year career, retiring as a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. He served the last 20 years as a senior pastor in a variety of capacities, including command chaplain for the Pacific Air Forces, deputy commandant for the Chaplain Corps College, and as Chaplain Corps Deputy Chief of Plans and Programs in the Pentagon. Dr. Nayland has authored 4 books, including Loving When You Don't Feel Like It, and his latest book, The Courage to Stand, A New America. Dr. Nayland has garnered 7 academic degrees, including an Associates of Science in Logistics Management, a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Technology, Master of Arts in Religion, a Master of Divinity, a Master of Science in Community Counseling, a Master of Science in National Security and Strategy, and a Doctor of Ministry degree. He has also received over 100 distinguished awards and decorations throughout his career for outstanding service to his nation. So please welcome our panelists. And we'll start with Professor Bill Curtis.
Hi. So I stepped out to go grab my reading glasses, which I didn't even need a couple of years ago. And they decided that we'd go in alphabetical order when I got back. So you're stuck with me first. So that was wonderful, Professor Deneen. I'm a big fan of virtue for politics, but I would say liberal virtue, which might be contrasted with some of the virtue that you're talking about tonight that derived from the ancient world. Liberal virtue, as I see it, are qualities like the ability to respect the rights of others, which is no easy moral demand to do it effectively, right? And to be able to listen to the other side of arguments and these sorts of things. Exactly the sorts of skills that the children learned at Trinity Academy. Professor Deneen's remarks tonight, his talk tonight, reminded me of this great quote from Hannah Arendt, who said that, and I paraphrase here, every generation we're invaded by barbarians whom we must civilize. We call them children. And I think that goes well with Professor Deneen's remarks tonight. My son, by the way, I wasn't expecting all the fork and knife talk, which I thought was wonderful. My son, who just turned 13, I still have to get on his case about using his fork. Anyway, so Professor Deneen is famous for his book. He probably doesn't even want to talk about it because he's famous for it. He's been talking about his book, Why Liberalism Failed, for several years now, and even President Barack Obama recommended this book to the country, to everyone. And so I sort of came, so we didn't have a copy of the speech beforehand, and I sort of came ready to sort of offer my defense of liberalism, and I guess I'll go ahead and do it, although it's not exactly an address to Professor Deneen's remarks, although it is relevant, I think. So I'm going to play the role of Panglossian defender of classical liberalism, though this is a bit unfair to liberalism, because true liberalism appreciates the deeply tragic aspect of life. And Dr. Pangloss, in Voltaire's novel Candide, of course, naively believes and is committed to the proposal that we're living in the best of all possible worlds. We're clearly not. We're clearly not. And these times do seem trying. Although I do suspect that maybe every generation says that. But in any case, even Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who is famous for documenting all the ways that the world's gotten so much better in the modern age, acknowledges that we do face serious challenges. Nevertheless, the main theme of my remarks tonight will be the virtue of gratitude, which, by the way, some would argue is the dispositional essence of sort of small c conservatism. First, I want to express my gratitude to all those who worked to put this together. This is fantastic. And to all of you who came here to listen and engage in discussion with us tonight. And also, from the bottom of my John Stuart Million liberal heart, I want to express my gratitude to Professor Deneen for making his journey out here from Notre Dame to share his ideas with us. His critique of liberalism and suggestions for an alternative that you heard tonight are eloquent and provocative in the best ways. John Stuart Mill, the most important 19th century philosopher of liberalism, of course emphasizes the importance of criticism of our deepest beliefs and values. This criticism, the challenge, keeps them alive and vibrant and helps us understand them better. Thus, Professor Deneen, from the liberal point of view, is doing liberalism a favor by challenging it. For this, liberals should have gratitude. We should also, however, be grateful for liberalism. Indeed, this entire event tonight, in a way, represents a gift of liberalism. We gathered here tonight using various modes of transportation, cars, airplanes, which are truly miraculous, perhaps even 21st century bicycles with precision machined gears and made of alloys and such, right? None of these would be possible without liberalism, which affords the ability to freedom for modern science to flourish. We earlier had a delicious dinner, which I hope all of you did as well, provided by the modern liberal market economy. And if you want to better understand how it did this, I direct you to the work of that genius of the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith. And here we are, exercising our liberal rights to freedom and assembly, and our liberal rights to freedom of assembly and expression, carrying on a discussion that involves serious criticism of our current political regime and values, and we're not in the least worried about being hauled off to jail. Miraculous, miraculous. I could go on all night listing the gifts of liberalism from modern medicine to the lifting of 1 billion people around the globe out of extreme poverty over just the last half century, to the fact that we can all access just about all the world's art, music, and literature at the press of a button, and a lot of garbage, I'll give you that. But here's one more cool thing that William Nordhaus, the Nobel-winning economist, calculated, right? That the cost in terms of human labor of producing light has diminished by orders of magnitude, right? We used to have to build fires and make candles, now we flip a switch. One of the gifts of the liberal age of enlightenment is literally light. And if the Flynn effect is correct, our IQs are even increasing every generation. Now, you watch television, you're dubious of this. You can't possibly be getting smarter. But those of you who have children at the Trinity Academy, you know that they're smarter than you were at their age. You know it. In terms of liberalism waging war on nature, it is true that we are affecting the environment in much more radical ways than we did before the liberal age. Just by the fact that so many more people are alive today because of the material abundance and the security that liberalism provides. But we also know that it's the most developed economies that are becoming the most green and trending the most green. This is the claim of the so-called environmental Kuznets curve, which you can look up. It's controversial, though. It's a larger argument, but a strategy of economic degrowth favored by environmental activists to save the environment is simply not morally attractive nor politically feasible, especially globally. Economic growth with the technological innovation it brings is what will enable us to address and adapt to environmental challenges. And economic growth means liberalism. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead because I'm probably taking up too much time and I'm really going to feel. But I do want to say this. In terms of corruption, people feel like we have lost virtue. And like I said, I think that liberal virtue takes just as much effort to cultivate as the ancient conception of virtue. And again, we do this through liberal arts education. And we do need to focus more and more on that. We need to put more effort and do a better job of liberally educating our children. The evidence does show that in liberal market economies, that people tend to be more conscientious, more cooperative, indeed more virtuous than in non-liberal market countries. So in conclusion, I express my concern to Professor Deneen, depending on just how radical his political alternative is, which he sort of made a gesture tonight. I do fear that, at least in the notes he sent us, he talked about the line between the private and the political sphere, and maybe that we've given too much freedom in the political sphere, we haven't connected them as well. And yet it's one of the virtues of the liberal order that we do give space to private life. It doesn't mean anything goes. As Locke would say, anything goes is license, not liberty. Liberty is what we can exercise, not license. And we need the private realm to be able to do that, apart from the public political realm, apart from the state interfering in that private realm. And that's kind of what I worry about, at least in the sketch that Professor Deneen gave us. I was wondering about this. He's heard the criticism many times and is probably bored with it, but his proposed alternative sometimes sounds to liberal ears very utopian and romantic, and thus perhaps unrealistic and dangerous. As Nathaniel Hawthorne wisely wrote at the beginning of his Scarlet Letter, the founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery and another portion as a site of a prison. If you like peace and prosperity and individual freedom, even with its downsides, which it inevitably has, as all human things do, history has shown that illiberal, non-liberal alternatives don't work out well. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. So Professor Hall is next.
All right, super. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting this. This has been a wonderful evening. Patrick, an excellent talk. Thank you. I love the way you set up the talk with the Cyclops. I love the Odyssey as well. You got the Cyclops, this horrible beast who smashes men and eats them, and when he's blinded, the other Cyclops don't care. It's in the community. And you contrast this with the humane community, where people come together, cooperate, create food, eat together, share stories, and who wouldn't want to laugh, obviously, right? And I agree with everything you say about what you observe on TV. All sorts of messages of find yourself, authenticity, be yourself. Absolutely, it's everywhere. But as you know better than I, Aristotle says man is by nature a political animal. And I think the problem of our contemporary society, and this really is a pushback, I'm just curious what you think about this, is that we have a bunch of individuals running every which way doing their own thing. It's that we have the formation of tribes. And these tribes then identify themselves in terms of characteristics, and they share these characteristics, and then they go to war with other tribes. And as you point out, and I think accurately enough, certainly throughout all of American history, we have had all sorts of conflicts, and anti-federalists and federalists and abolitionists and so we've had all sorts of various conflicts over issues, and oftentimes involving race and gender and religion and that sort of thing. I don't want to overstate this point, but it does strike me there might be a sense in which we're developing into tribes in a way that we haven't seen before, or maybe to a certain extent in a more extreme way, right? And I think social media might have something to do with this, because now we can get together with groups of very like-minded individuals and reinforce each other and condemn the other, and this generates a additional animosity. I haven't read this book, but I heard a podcast about it. I've been thinking a little bit about this, and it seems like this might fit a little bit with what we're chatting about. I gather if the person who wrote this book is accurate, something like 50 years ago, you had almost no young lady who would think she was a boy. You had 12, 13-year-old young lady who thinks she's a boy. You had a very rare, every once in a while, a boy who wanted to dress like a girl, and people would address this as something that should be addressed. Nowadays, we just see skyrocketing numbers of young ladies who think they're boys. And oftentimes, this is connected to social media, right? Someone will come out as a guy, and she'll be celebrated, or he will be celebrated by the class. And so you have this social media created phenomenon where individuals are choosing to be authentic in a way that maybe isn't authentic at all, right? And I think all of us do this, on the left, on the right, around all sorts of various cultural issues, political issues. And so I suppose if there's a question in all that, is a problem that we're all just running around being individuals, or is it the problem that we're sorting ourselves into tribes in a way that it's not completely unique or different, but there's maybe something unique about it, and we should be concerned about that, and we must think about how to address this tribalization of American politics.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks, Dr. Deneen, and fellow panelists and everyone here tonight. What an honor just to be able to sit on the stage with the great minds and talk about this subject that is near and dear to me in a different way, in the sense of coming from the spiritual background, the military background, and all of that over the years shaped by serving our nation around the world in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as I was reviewing the bio of Dr. Deneen, I was impressed, as you were, Bill, with President Obama recognizing him in his book, Why Liberalism Failed. And I thought about it, and I said, well, let me review the book myself, and I got the quote. We should rightly wonder whether America is not in the early days of its eternal life, but rather approaching the end of the natural cycle of corruption and decay that limits the lifespan of all human creations. I think I got that right. And I thought about the four elements that were highlighted in the book of income inequality, cultural decline, erosion of freedom, and growth of powerful centralized bureaucracies. And I was focusing in on, and I started thinking about all of the George Floyd situations we've gone through, COVID-19, which side are you on? Do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? What is freedom? What is not freedom? How dare you take my rights? If I march for the rights of a person who was heinously murdered in the streets by a law officer, am I taking up for Black Lives Matter, or am I just calling out justice? And when you think about all of this, and that's why I love what Dr. Deneen does, is it causes us in those four key elements, I think, to really zoom in and move to civility, to a point of recognizing the humanity in each of us. And as you gathered in this room tonight, and the ones who are looking online, we welcome you as well. But I want us to think about what I believe, and I'm not speaking for him, but I'm interpreting, is that if we can move society to a respect for all mankind, laws exist for a reason. And any society without laws and guidelines would be chaos. And if you look at Athens and the early Greek political structures and all of these things that we gleaned back in my academic days of society, where we learned civil treatment and politeness and kindness, that's what we need today. And we need to fight together, work together, whether Democratic, Independent, Republican, and move to a new America, an America that recognizes the value of law and recognizes the value of freedom. Bill recognizes creativity, but within a certain guideline. Because without law, it would be chaos. I said that already, didn't I? And it's true, because if we had no laws, like no one in here would dare believe that to molest a child would be right. I dare say no one. We could all agree on that matter. There has to be laws, and there has to be certain rules that speak to civility. And so I believe that this night reminds us simply that if we work together as humans with dignity, respect, we can maybe bridge the inequality gap. That's, by the way, top 20% of the population earn 52% of all income in America. And if you look at the median income of $67,000 for the average, but the poorest person is averaging $14,000 roughly. Those are gaps that we can work together to bridge through education and technology and advancement to eliminate or mitigate poverty. And then if you look at our cultural decline, and I'll wrap it up there, it's amazing where murder is happening. Come on, we see it in Portland. We see the crime rate. We see the vileness across the United States, where there's stabbings, there's killings of loved ones, murdering. It's indiscriminate. My daughter lives in New Orleans, and she tells me that my hometown, it's like a war zone, where you can go to get gas and you will be hijacked. But you can give up your keys, give up your purse, give up your wallet, but they will still shoot you. This is what we are becoming in America. And when will America say, it's time to stop? It's time to come together. It's time to end the political divide and unify over common civility, common values, that wants to see freedom for all people, but at the same time we recognize that we're all not the same, we're not all gonna do the same, but that's okay, as long as we're treating everyone with dignity and fairness. And so I'll wrap it up with my preacher voice. Civility, rules, respect, reverence, caring, loving, honoring. Those are just some words that reminds me of what we can be doing together as Americans. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I appreciate the dialogue.
Thank you, all of you, for such thoughtful. I think all three could I would be justified in speaking at 3 times the length I did, and I apologize for going on such length. I guess let me just try to. I'm not sure I can respond to every point, but maybe we'll touch on a few things in a conversation. Let me just begin by maybe saying a little bit of what I didn't end up saying about liberalism. Problem that we faced today I alluded to it a little bit toward the end, but I knew what was going on. I contrast what I was speaking about in terms of Aristotle and I think the classical biblical understanding of, in a sense, the relationship of the natural and the conventional, or the natural and the artificial. That in some ways human beings are creatures of artifice. We are, by nature, creatures that create artifice in order to perfect our nature. But of course, those artifices can be used to corrupt or to make worse our nature. And I contrast this. This is one of the ways in which I find myself deeply a critic of what I see as the foundations of the liberal order, which is the order that in many ways we live in. It might be the source of some of the corruption. So it's interesting listening to my 2 political science friends, one of whom said everything's getting better and better in every way, and one of them says things are getting terrible and getting worse. Political science is split over a very important question. The empirical evidence can go a couple of different ways. Let me suggest that liberalism as a political philosophy begins with a rejection of this Aristotelian understanding, or this biblical understanding, that understands us as creatures that by nature must use artifice to perfect our own nature. And those artifices include things like eating table manners, but of course includes things like schools. How long, and you students in the audience, you know this, how long you have to go to school and how many hours you have to put in. I see somebody, just the head bobbing. how much effort goes into perfecting ourselves. We humans take a long time to become human. My dog didn't take very long to become a dog. He pretty much knew exactly what to do. I did a few things to teach you how to walk as in the way that I wanted it to, and you how to talk. So we human beings are instinct deficient. We require a lot of artifice to become human. But the liberal order begins with the following presupposition. And I'll begin with a proto or pre-liberal author, Thomas Hobbes, but someone who influences John Locke, as was mentioned, who argues that if we want to understand and see human nature, we have to understand and see human nature as what exists outside of convention, what exists outside of the city, what exists before there's any city or any convention. Then we'll know what our nature really is. And guess what we are? We're cyclops. That's what we are. By nature, we are all cyclops. This is what Hobbes describes in the state of nature. All we want to do is devour each other. And so we agree, we contract to create a political structure, a political order, because we're all cyclops inside, and our inner cyclops just wants to get out. And if we don't have law that controls us, and we don't have a sovereign, a political order that restricts and restrains our cyclops nature, it's all just chaos and mayhem, and life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Now, this is the argument that separates the idea that somehow it is our nature to be conventional. And thus, while we have law, we have conventions, it leaves our nature, in a sense, it acts opposite to our nature. Our nature is to want to consume, to fulfill our desires. And the only thing that holds us back is the threat of the physical force of the state. That's the only thing that keeps us from acting as our brute nature would demand. And it's our knowledge of how we would behave that leads us to the point in which we understand that the contract is needed to restrict our nature. Now, this divide of nature and convention is one that's also expressed by John Stuart Mill, the hero suggested by Professor Curtis, who is a villain in my story. And he's a villain in my story because Mill gets up and he says, well, the problem is that we have all this convention. We've got all these traditions and customs that restrain our true selves. It restrains our authenticity. What does he say? He condemns the despotism of custom. Because the despotism of custom prevents us from engaging in experiments in living and expressing our true selves. He's the kind of originator of the theory of authenticity. If we can only overcome and dispel all that tradition, our true nature could emerge, and true progress could emerge. Now, he has a more confident and optimistic view of what might emerge. But notice the suggestion that we oscillate between in a liberal society. We are either a society that must always have extreme and harsh forms of law and order, or our inner cyclops will come out. Or we must overthrow that law and order and those constraints and custom so that our true selves, our good selves, our progressive selves can emerge. And notice how much that describes contemporary American society, oscillating constantly between the calls and demands for law and order and the calls and demands that we be released so that we can be authentic. And I think that lies somewhat behind what we're seeing in terms of the tribes. It turns out that the law and order regime has not treated certain people well in our society. But when we release the law and order, and all we've been taught is that we're just cyclopes, we're not very good when we get authentic, as I discovered last night when I was walking around downtown Portland. We're not really good when we're just... So somewhere in the midst of this, what we have lost is the idea, it seems to me, that we are creatures who need convention. Now, there's good convention and there's bad convention. Let's talk about a good convention. A good convention is what you students at Trinity Academy are doing. What was mentioned earlier, it's a liberal arts education. And to at least touch on, before I stop, to touch on the theme of this lecture, what is a liberal arts education? It is that which teaches us the art of being free. And here I think every one of us would agree on this. It turns out to learn to be free is hard. Hobbes would say we just have it by nature. Once we're released from law, then we're free. But as Professor Hall suggested, that's license. Professor Curtis mentioned, is license. Certainly important to Christian understanding, that's license. That's not genuine freedom. Genuine freedom is that when we learn the capacity of governing ourselves, and when you undertake a curriculum like these students do at Trinity Academy, you are learning the art of being free. Because you're encountering through these constant retellings, right, the new generation of barbarians who have to encounter all the things that Odysseus encounters, and all the things, the wonderful things and the horrible things that lie above, beneath, and on the face of the earth. We learn what it is to be a human being. To be a human being is to learn that art of being genuinely free. And I think that's something that, whether we want to call ourselves a liberal or not a liberal or critical of liberals, that's something our society desperately needs. And it seems to me we need resources that stretch and reach outside and beyond and be older than the liberal tradition to learn those particular set of lessons.
So I assume that you guys might want to respond to that a little bit.
Here, I thought we were. This is on? Oh, yeah. I thought we were running out of time. So, of course, as Professor Deneen knows, I have a different reading of the liberal tradition he does. I think Hobbes, for instance, as Professor Deneen has acknowledged, right, we do have the Cyclops within, right? And Hobbes focuses on that. He says what we should focus on, unlike the ancients who focused on how we can be the best we can be. Hobbes said, listen, we disagree about that. There's pluralism around the world. The Greeks had a certain ideal, a certain male ideal in particular, of what the good life was. Hobbes says, look, if we're going to be realistic here, we just want to make sure the Cyclops doesn't come out. Unfortunately, of course, his solution is an authoritarian ruler. But if you read his book, Leviathan, his famous book, Leviathan, where he discusses these things, you realize is that his law of natures that he talks about that human beings need to cultivate ends up being a whole bunch of virtues. Get along with others, don't be vengeful, be cooperative, be sociable, and these sorts of things. And this translates through Locke up to Mill. I mean, Mill is one of our biggest advocates of sort of liberal education, learning about different ideas, different ways of thought, different ways of life. And recognizing that we don't have the knowledge, that's why experimentation is necessary, but it's not unconstrained experimentation. It is experimentation, as the Reverend said, within the bounds of law. Now the laws evolve too, but it's the virtues gained through liberal education that help us understand the balance that must be struck between innovation and experimentation and respect to custom. Because one way to understand Mill is not that he wants to blow through custom. He does want to challenge custom, but how does he want to challenge it? He wants us to challenge it by learning all the other customs we can and playing them off against each other and trying to find which ones we find most interesting, we find most meaningful, since it all is, a journey to find meaning.
I'm sure we could all talk here for a long time, but I know we're probably late in the day. I would love to hear if anybody has anything they'd like to ask.
Please come forward.
Yeah, I just had a question about kind of the history of civility and civic discourse in politics. I had read something, I can't remember the source or anything, but it kind of mentioned that before World War II, it was actually very common for people to discuss politics socially. And then kind of after World War II, kind of wanting to put some of that darkness behind from the past few decades, and then also consumerism and kind of living the American dream, that changed. I kind of feel a need that we somehow, if that is true, that could happen. I feel like that is, a piece of the solution. Braver Angels, is a new organization that's trying to start those kind of conversations. Could you just speak to a little bit of that, maybe kind of what that path might look for, especially, I think, speaking of polarization, a lot of the liberal ideas, even from a conservative, that sounds great, but there are these extreme factions, that are now growing, the barbarians are growing up, and they're much more extreme. So You know, and I work with a lot of youth. Frankly, a lot of the guys that you know, I've been employed with, that have been employed with us, you know, they're young 20-somethings, and I can already see it in them. I mean, these precious young people just do not have the toolkit to get us through there.
So that, I mean, there's a lot, I think that's more a statement than a question. Most of it, there's so much, I really appreciate, you know, I think every sentiment that you expressed, I mean, it echoes what Mr. Nalen was saying. You know, one of the things that social science can't prove much. You know, we have entire departments, political science and sociology, that really can't prove much of anything. I happen to be a member of one. There we go. You can fire me now, Notre. But one of the things that it's actually really good at proving, it seems to me, is levels of connectivity that we see in our society. Social scientists seem to have developed pretty good tools at measuring the ways in which we are either in connection with each other or we are in separation with each other. And long before the invention of social media, we were already disconnecting. We were already disconnecting because we were no longer members of various groups and associations. We were no longer members of sort of towns and communities, right? The development of the suburbs, or at least begins a kind of separation. The automobile, of course, is a technology that separates. I mean, it allows us to get together, as was suggested, but I think there's also ways of seeing the automobile as a kind of problem, which is that it creates new forms of life and new forms of transportation that disconnects us. So there's a very vast literature of how disassociated we become over the course of the 20th century until today. And of course, we might think social media connects us, but I'm talking about the kind of face-to-face social interaction that requires a degree of sort of responsibility. That when I say something to you, I have to look at your face, and we have to be in response to each other. This is a kind of habituation that one undergoes in such kinds of social human interactions. It's an habituation of how we interact with each other in a way that is responsible, in which we have differences, but we come to know those differences and understand those differences. Alexis de Tocqueville, whose name I mentioned earlier, who visits America in the early part of the 19th century, he comes to America and he marvels and admires American democracy because Americans are so good at coming together politically and socially and discussing and arguing and debating and resolving various issues, social, political, economic, and otherwise. And he says what they have developed, what we in France have not, is what he calls the arts of association. He says through the arts of association, through the constant interaction, interplay of different points of view, he says, one of course enters a political debate or social debate with one's own views. But he says after those interactions, he says, something can change. As John was suggesting about when I interact with colleagues at times, and he says the heart is enlarged as a consequence of that. So I think we can talk a lot about we need civility, you know, we need this or that, but I think we're not going to have civility will follow the beginning, the effort to, in various ways, invigorate the forms and ways that are not going to be the way they were, but new forms of human interaction that require us in some ways to responsibly and with responsibility to interact in ways that we have to, in a sense, own our position and recognize and hear and respond to the position of other people. And unless we recognize that there's been a real change, and I think a fundamental challenge to our democratic way of life, in this kind of large breakdown of the associational way of life, then the chance for civility is almost nil, unless we have forms of habituation.
All right. So we're over time here. Thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker and our panelists. We do have a light reception out the doors. It's a chance if you guys want to meet anybody, continue the conversation, ask any questions. We invite you to do so. But thanks again so much for coming. And yeah, and we will keep you all posted next time we do one of these, which will be next year, we expect. But thanks again, and God bless you.